If you're a fan of the Star Wars Legends expanded universe, you may have heard the term Denningverse, and you may even know what that means, in which case congratulations, you've spent too much time online. But in case you don't, the term Denningverse refers to a specific period of Star Wars publishing, both in an in-universe period sense and out-of-universe period. We're going to talk about generally what it is, including some spoilers. I'm going to talk about why some people tend to have negative feelings towards it, and I'm going to put it in the context of broader Star Wars media and publishing in a way which I think might itself be a little controversial, because my ultimate point has little to actually do with Troy Denning, good or bad. So broadly speaking, the period here refers to the books released after the New Jedi Order series in the post-Endor timeline, starting with the Dark Nest trilogy released in 2005, and set about 35 years after the Battle of Endor. It then goes through the 9-book Legacy of the Force series, dealing with the fall of Jacen Solo in the Second Galactic Civil War, the next 9-book series after that called Fate of the Jedi, which is where Abeloth comes in, and finally it wraps up with Crucible, which is the last chronological novel in the Star Wars Legends expanded universe. There are a few other novels mixed into this period, like Millennium Falcon by James Luceno, but the majority of the overarching narrative is told in Dark Nest, Legacy of the Force, Fate of the Jedi, and Crucible. All of these novels were published between 2005 and 2013. The reason this era is referred to colloquially as the Denningverse is because the majority of the books were written by Troy Denning. He wrote the Dark Nest trilogy in its entirety, 6 of the 18 Legacy of the Force and Fate of the Jedi novels, which were published by basically alternating between 3 authors for each one. Troy Denning was one of the 2 authors in both, along with Aaron Alston, and then he was also the solo author behind Crucible. So while he didn't write everything in this period, he wrote the bulk of it, and as a result, his own ideas and interpretations of both things that had already happened and things which should happen took on a significant amount of importance. You were essentially never more than one book away from a Troy Denning book, whether it was going to be the last book you read or the next book you would read. The term is generally, though not always, used in a kind of derogatory way, since in a lot of corners the post-New Jedi Order era is fairly controversial, as is the New Jedi Order era itself, as are the prequels, as is the Clone Wars, and so on, you get it. There are very few things in Star Wars which were not controversial when they released. So this video isn't actually going to be about hashing out every reason people like or dislike the Denningverse, but the short version is that the story took a fairly different direction than what a lot of people expected coming out of the New Jedi Order books. A lot of this centers on the way 2 characters developed after the NJO. These are Jacen Solo and his mentor Vergere. Basically, Vergere had been a former Jedi who went to live with the Yuuzhan Vong in captivity, and then taught Jacen a lot of what she had learned about the Yuuzhan Vong, allowing him to understand both them, the Force, and the relationship between the Yuuzhan Vong and the Force in a way that others in the galaxy did not. Jacen then achieves a level of oneness with the Force and is instrumental in ending the war without wiping out the Yuuzhan Vong. The Dark Nest Crisis trilogy, picking up 5 years later, has Jacen coming back from a sabbatical where he was exploring a variety of other Force traditions, and he starts falling to the dark side. He's not strictly on the dark side in the early phases of Legacy of the Force or in the Dark Nest Crisis, but he's doing a bunch of pretty messed up stuff, and you start to see a very different interpretation of the character from what came before, especially in the later stages of the Yuuzhan Vong War. A lot of where this goes stems from an unpublished reference work by Troy Denning called the Vergere Compendium, where he essentially laid out a blueprint for how they could retcon Vergere into having been a Sith the whole time, trying to set up for the fall of Jacen. This is something that was very different from the intent of Matthew Stover, the author of Traitor, when exploring the relationship between Jacen and Vergere. I've already done a standalone video on why I think this was handled in a way that fundamentally not only misunderstands but misrepresents everything Vergere did and said, so I'm not going to rehash that here, and I do plan on doing a full breakdown on Jacen's storyline from Young Jedi Knights through Legacy of the Force. It's something that's been on my YouTube bucket list since I started this channel, so I won't go into too much of that either. The really short version is that the way Denning kind of perceived it, Vergere and Matthew Stover were trying to set up a version of the Force where the light and dark side didn't exist. Regardless of the specifics, the result was a pretty different idea from what the other authors had in mind for Jacen at the end of the NJO, and from what most fans expected from him at that point. I don't think that would be even a particularly controversial statement among people who are bigger fans of the Legacy of the Force storyline, and I don't think it's even something that Troy Denning himself would necessarily disagree with. To a certain extent, it was just a way to find a new direction the story could go in. They decided they wanted another Sith Lord character, Jacen became that Sith Lord, and he was the new big bad going into Legacy of the Force, and this really shaped how Legacy of the Force and Fate of the Jedi would play out. There are some other shifts in tone and direction as well. The New Jedi Order has a reputation of being kind of the grimdark version of Star Wars, which is part of what makes it less appealing to people who preferred the lighter-hearted Bantam era stuff published earlier. We kind of went from lower stakes Imperial Enemy of the Day storylines into something where any main character was kind of under threat of being killed off. But I would argue that the New Jedi Order, while it does kill off a lot of people, has more the aesthetics of grimdark, while maintaining a core message of hope, empathy, and humanity. There's a lot of pain and suffering, and the Yuuzhan Vong are definitely super edgy, but the core struggles for the characters are things like making sure they're able to help refugees, and trying to stop the war by coming to some kind of understanding with the Yuuzhan Vong as a species, resisting the urge to resort to genocide put forward by some of the allies of our main characters. The internal struggle in the New Jedi Order series is as important, if not more important, than the fight with the Yuuzhan Vong. And I've personally always felt like there's an extent to which the Legacy of the Force series sets aside the core moral center of a lot of these characters, and instead of engaging with that as heavily, the things which happen are motivated more by a sense of realpolitik, while Jacen, who has always been a guy who tried to make everyone stop and think about the implications of what they're doing, even if he didn't always come to the best short-term conclusions and was kind of annoying about it sometimes, fueled this probably more than any other individual character in the series. Again, this isn't a video made to tell you you should or shouldn't like the Legacy of the Force books or the Denningverse more generally. There are a lot of elements of it where I think it gets a bit too much flack, and with a lot of Star Wars media, I think your opinion on it is going to depend on where you came into reading the expanded universe and which pieces of media you value the most. The New Jedi Order series in particular was a big part of making me as big a fan as I am of Star Wars, so it holds a kind of outsized importance in my mind. This is an opinion that was shared by Eckhart Slatter when we did the books on Tapcaf, for example. He enjoys them, but they're not as central to him. And while I don't want to misrepresent his thoughts on this or speak for him, I think he was someone who holds the opinion that Star Wars went a bit too far in the grimdark direction with New Jedi Order. On the flip side, there are probably also a lot of people who got into Star Wars through the Legacy of the Force books who would weigh that stuff a lot more heavily than the New Jedi Order, for example. A lot of that comes down to personal choice and preference and frame of reference. You can see a lot of the similar dynamics at play here as with the difference between people who are bigger fans of the original Clone Wars multimedia project versus the later Clone Wars 2008 cartoon. And none of this has to be mutually exclusive. I spend a lot of time in videos talking about how these kinds of dichotomies end up not really serving anyone. What I want to focus on more with respect to the Denningverse is more what happens when Star Wars gets driven so heavily based on just one person's perspective. I don't think it's entirely fair to ascribe all of this, positive or negative, to Denning alone. Aaron Alston also wrote 6 of the Legacy of the Force and Fate of the Jedi books, with Karen Traviss and Christy Golden contributing the other 3 of each of those series respectively. So all of them, along with individuals like editors Shelley Shapiro and Sue Rastoni, contributing their own ideas, and you can certainly feel that at play. In the Legacy of the Force books, the books by Alston have much more focus on former X-Wing characters, while in Travis's book, the Mandalorians suddenly become the most important factors in galactic politics. But the core path of the series came out from Denning's ideas about Jacen Vergere, and the whole era is bookended by Denning's work in the Dark Nest Crisis, which sets up for a lot of this and then gets wrapped up in Crucible. This comes in contrast to what I'll call the 2 prior post-Endor publishing periods, where the New Jedi Order had a lot more voices involved, and I don't think any one individual person's views dominated in quite the same way. You sort of had James Luceno in a coordination role, but he wasn't unique in that capacity, he wasn't the only one weighing in, and with 19 different books by a variety of authors where everyone kind of had their little section, then it got passed off to the next person, there wasn't one person deciding the tone and the way things would come together in the same way that Denning's novels did within the Denningverse. Some authors did a single book like Vector Prime by R.A. Salvatore, there were duologies like Edge of Victory, focusing on different sets of characters with a few main cast and some through lines, but while each author had to reach certain story beats, the way they did that actually left a lot of flexibility. And then going back even further into the period prior to the New Jedi Order, the Bantam period, it was even more freeform, which came along with it being a lot less connected and more often contradictory, where some authors would like this video and subscribe for more while others would not. People wrote their adventures of the week, introduced whatever characters they introduced, and off they went. Some books, like the Thrawn trilogy, were a lot more prominent, but again, no single voice dominated in the same way. I think the NJO model, or even the Bantam model, leaves a lot more room for wider appeal within Star Wars than what we see with the Denningverse, where if you like what's going on, great, but if you don't mesh with that particular person's view of the story, then you're really going to struggle to get into the period and anything that comes after it. And I want to be clear that, as I said at the top of the video, it's not about Troy Denning himself. To keep using his work as an example, he also wrote Tatooine Ghost in the earlier post-Endor period, although he wrote that much later, and he wrote Star by Star, arguably the pivotal novel of the New Jedi Order series. But because that was one book of 19, albeit the longest book of 19, and an important one, there was less room for some of his ideas to dominate the universe the way they ultimately came to. And I actually enjoy a lot of Troy Denning's kind of moment-to-moment writing and smaller-scale character work, even if I sometimes disagree with some of his bigger picture elements. I'm not going to try to hide that I don't love his use of Jacen and Vergere later, but I think in Star by Star he does a really good job handling both of those characters, setting up what becomes their much more important relationship later. He writes some fun action, he has a lot of fun character interactions, even if I think he falls short on character motivations. Really short in some examples, and objectionably so when it comes to characters like Tahiri, which is a whole different topic. But ultimately, I think when he's part of a bigger team, there's a lot of positives he can add to the experience. And if you don't think that, it's easier to just not read Tatooine Ghost or Star by Star than it is to not read almost every single book after the New Jedi Order series. And the exact same thing could be said in different ways about pretty much anyone in a similar position. A lot of similar conversations are had about Dave Filoni, and I ultimately think it comes down to not wanting one person's pet characters and ideas to dominate what everyone else is able to do. If you're James Luceno writing Millennium Falcon set between Legacy of the Force and Fate of the Jedi, sure you can add things in, but if it's not what Troy Denning ends up wanting to pick up for Fate of the Jedi and Crucible, it'll end up feeling less important, and you do have to start with using the things set up by Troy Denning in prior works. And I don't think this just comes down to putting the quote-unquote right person at the apex of Star Wars storytelling. Timothy Zahn is often brought up as the person who should be in some way in charge of Star Wars, for example, which usually people equate with being the person driving the narrative in a way I think we can equate to the influence Denning had during this period. But I feel like Zahn, along with anyone else you could name, would end up garnering a lot of similar complaints to Denning himself if he were in this position. I love his work, but where some people like Kevin J. Anderson and James Luceno really excel at bringing in references and consistency with other material, to Zahn that's always been secondary, and sometimes seems to be kind of an annoyance to him if you read the notes in Heir to the Empire. I've covered some of the differences between how he handled the Chiss ascendancy and how the Chiss were portrayed as a faction before he started to really work on them, and there were a lot of contradictions which match or exceed the issues people had with how George Lucas and Dave Filoni handled the Mandalorians in the Clone Wars. It's just the books are lower profile and the Chiss play a smaller role. Zahn similarly had issues with the New Jedi Order's tone and stakes overall. This isn't to say he's right or wrong there, and that there can't be stories which reflect his view of Star Wars, but I think Star Wars tends to be at its best when there's multiple sources of ideation without one specific focus overriding everything else. And to some extent, you could probably even say the New Jedi Order fits into that as well, even if I personally really like it. And to be even more clear, that isn't to single out just saying that Timothy Zahn would be the wrong person to be in that position. The point is that every author, every potential person in that position has their own foibles and preferences and their own characters that they would go to. It's a lot easier to enjoy the sardonic smiles of Talon Card during a Timothy Zahn book if that isn't going to be the only thing on tap. And while I enjoy Ahsoka as a character, I think it's fair to say that it's okay to have a few stories where we don't need to wonder, well, what does Ahsoka have to do with this? And to be honest, I think this extends to George Lucas as well. People would certainly be more open to his ideas dominating the galaxy since he's the one who got everyone on board, but the response to the prequels and the Clone Wars show that's not universally true either. As soon as you open things up to the expanded universe, there are people who are going to be more attached to that than the movies, even if the movies are the primary form of media. As someone who has always been more a book fan than a movie fan, something which honestly does extend into how I enjoy Star Wars, I think there's a lot to be said for having more room for different voices to expand the universe. Let me know what you think in the comments though. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.